United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres travels to Ethiopia this week for the African Union Summit. In part 2 of his conversation with VOA UN correspondent Margaret Basheer, Guterres discusses China's role in Africa and the prospects for peace in South Sudan and the Central African Republic.
Secretary General, is there a conflict or a crisis in Africa that you think can be successfully resolved this year?
Now, we are very committed to a surge in diplomacy for peace that is very much linked, again, with the African Union's initiative to silence the arms in 2020. We have Libya, where I hope it will be possible to have a national conference in which Libyans will assume a new dynamic to find a political solution for Libya. We have an agreement that was signed between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir in South Sudan. Things are going slowly, but they are moving in the right direction. And the conflict of South Sudan has been probably one of the most devastating from the humanitarian point of view that we had in Africa. We have just an agreement established for Central African Republic between the government and different armed groups, again, with the African Union leadership and UN support. I think that the work that we have done together in prevention of conflict, for instance, in electoral situations, in the DRC, trying to avoid a confrontation after, in Madagascar, where things, in Mali, many of these elections take place in difficult political contexts where it's easy to generate after the election a confrontation between the parties, to do everything to avoid it, this preventive action that we are doing together with the African Union and regional, sub-regional organizations is, I believe, giving a very important contribution to diminish the risks of conflict and to progressively find a way to address the conflicts that are still remaining. But there is a wind of hope in Africa. And I think the best symbol for that was reconciliation between Ethiopia and Eritrea. It was an initiative of Ethiopia, of the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia, but we see negotiations between Djibouti and Eritrea. We see a reconciliation between Eritrea and Somalia that already took place. We see in many other areas movement in the right direction, and we are totally committed to work together, the African Union and the African sub-regional organizations, to support this wind of hope, to make sure that the African continent is able to achieve its goal to end conflicts by 2020.
Secretary General, China is now the second largest contributor to UN peacekeeping behind the United States, and they're also playing a very large economic role on the continent. What's your assessment of China's role in Africa?
I think that when we have a cooperation of more developed countries with less developed countries, there are always risks, but it's very important to, and this is the UN's main mission, to work with the recipient countries to make sure that the Chinese cooperation is well integrated in the structure of the country, trickles down to benefit the economy of the country, because we want to avoid, in relation to the present cooperation that takes place, the same risks that we know in many other situations in which big projects sometimes do not fit in relation to the needs of a country. On the other hand, it's very important, everything to be done now in the global context in order to avoid debt to be too large. So there is a lot in which we can cooperate with the recipient countries, with China and with other investors in Africa. Our own objective is to make Africa overcome its difficulties, to make Africa a continent of hope, to make Africa a continent of future, to make Africa a pillar of the world in which we live, not seen as a problem, but seen as an opportunity.
Secretary General, thank you so much for your time today. Have a safe trip to Africa. Thank you.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking with VOA UN correspondent Margaret Basheer.